Sir, first of all, thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed your YouTube video. I wouldn't say I've enjoyed. I have enjoyed them, but I've been puzzled by them, been puzzled by the subject, and for people who have no idea what's going on, let's sort of unpack this for them. In Canada is very different than the United States. I love Canada. I'm a giant fan of Canada. If there's one place I would live outside of the U.S., 100% it would be Canada. I love it up there. I think the people are at least 20% more polite than America. But you've got some weird shit going on up there. And your king, what do you call him? Prime Minister? Trudeau? That fella?
The Castro lover.
The Castro lover. I was just going to say that. This fucking guy, and people have been posting today all the atrocities that Castro committed during his regime to sort of show how preposterous.
A few thousand firing squad deaths.
A few thousand. How about all the different people that they executed and then sold their blood to the Viet Cong?
Yes,
Did you see
I tweeted that one this morning.
Wonderful.
That
wonderful
was
man.
$50 a pint.
Yeah, he was a wonderful man, that fucking savage. Trudeau, and what he represents is, I think, the good side of it, what he's trying to do, they're trying to make a kinder, more progressive, more inclusive country. But along the way, what they're doing is they're promoting what you would call online social justice warrior values. And some of them are a little preposterous. You are one of the very few academics who have fought against some of these ideas that are not just being promoted, but are being enforced and written into law. And one of them is about gender pronouns. What we mean by gender pronouns is not just he and she, but a whole slew of invented gender pronouns that you're going to be compelled to use.
Yeah, you're already compelled to use, and likely in the States too, even though people don't know it yet. Certainly in New York, and the employment EEOC has already ruled on that with regards to businesses for the U.S. And
yeah, businesses, and I believe also landlords. I think, someone, if your landlord chooses to misgender you, and not just misgender you, like if you're a transgender woman, you used to be a man, now you're a woman, and they call you a he. It's not just that. Like, you're compelled to use how many? What is the number of them now?
Well, there's no standard nomenclature for the non-gender, for the non-binary types. There's many, many invented words, and which of those you're supposed to use is dependent entirely on the subjective choice of the person that you're talking with.
Now, most people, I believe, out there listening are going, "What the hell are they talking about right now?" We're talking about as many as 70 plus invented gender pronouns like Z, XE, ZER, HIR, a bunch of weird ones. And this is for people that don't necessarily think they're a he or a she. So they prefer these things. On top of that, you have animal kin. Which is
other kin. Worm self, which was the one I found most amusing.
Worm self, fox
I guess
kin.
That's for the low self-esteem otherkins.
This is people that truly believe that they are in the wrong body and that they should have been born some form of animal, and would like you to refer to them as this animal.
Or elf.
Mm-hmm. Or fairy. I've seen pixie.
Yeah.
Pixie kin.
I haven't seen Pixiekin. That's a good one.
Let's just get on Tumblr. Got to get on Tumblr.
Right, yes, absolutely.
That's where it all goes down. Professor Peterson, what the hell's going on? What is this?
Well, I think it's partly a form of narcissism.
Yes.
It's partly a consequence of the rise of the new rise again of say Marxist doctrine. I would say it's part of postmodernism. Maybe it's postmodernism more than anything else, because the postmodernists, that's a philosophical community, let's say, believe that the entire point of human categorization is power, and that dialogue between people is only a power dialogue, and that there's no real reality outside of interpretation, and that basically what we do is exchange interpretive viewpoints to ratchet up our dominance and status. And that's that. And there's no biology is an ideology, and the idea of the objective world is an ideology, and science is an ideology, and it's all interpretation all the way down, like turtles all the way down.
What do you mean by it's all about power? Like, in what way?
Well, you imagine that there are groups of people who are competing in the world for resources, I suppose, and that it's a zero-sum game, and it's every group against every other group. And the reason that we engage in dialogue isn't to establish the truth or move towards some closer approximation of reality, but to structure this social interaction so that our group comes up on top.
Right, and that is really what the problem is with all this, is that it's not just a matter of choosing to be defined in one way, but compelling others to define you in that way.
Well, one of the most awful elements of it, I think, is the idea that individuals should be defined in terms of their group identity at all. I mean, you could argue, and this is one of these weird inversions that's so characteristic of this chaotic state that we're in, when people originally started fighting against unfair discrimination, and I say unfair discrimination because lots of discrimination is fair. If you discriminate against people on the basis of their competence, that's perfectly reasonable. It's unfair discrimination that constitutes the proper battleground for people who have a more egalitarian viewpoint. But the initial idea was to eliminate the proclivity for people to be categorized according to their group identity, because that was interfering with everyone's ability to view them as competent individuals. But that got flipped probably in the 70s after the Soviet state so self-evidently was revealed as a catastrophe. That got flipped so that the world was turned into one group against another, power struggle from one group against another, and then the social justice warrior types and the lefties, even the Democratic Party, started categorizing everybody according to their ethnic or sexual or racial identity and made that the canonical element of their being. And that's an absolutely terrible thing to do. It leads to, in the Soviet Union, when that happened, for example, when they introduced that idea along with the notion of class guilt. So, for example, when the Soviets collectivized the farms, they pretty much wiped out or raped and froze to death all of their competent farmers. They called them kulaks, and they attributed class guilt to them because they were successful peasants, and they defined their success as oppression and theft. They killed all of them, pretty much, shipped them off to Siberia and froze them to death, and they were the productive agriculturalists in the Soviet Union. And then in the 1930s in the Ukraine, because of that, about 6 million Ukrainians starved to death. But the Soviets were big on collective guilt, and all of these things that you hear about now, like white privilege, for example, they're variants of collective guilt. I pick your bloody identity, whatever it happens to be, and then I make you a guilty member of that category, and then you and the rest of the guilty members of that category are judged as a unit. It's absolutely, it's murderous pushed to its extreme, and we've seen that many, many times.
Yeah, you're oppressed, or your opinions rather are suppressed, and you are automatically put into this category of people who should be dismissed because of the fact that you have white privilege. You should step back and let others talk. You should step back, and this is a narrative that gets repeated over and over again in the social justice warrior culture, this idea that you should just step back and let these others talk because they understand more.
And the others are always other group members.
Yes,
right. And somehow their discourse is to be privileged in reverse because hypothetically they're a member of an oppressed class.
Right.
Of course, and you can multiply the numbers of oppressed classes ad nauseum, which is another part of the problem.
Yeah, like the idea is that in giving them privilege because they have been marginalized, you will balance things out. You will somehow or another reverse the scale.
And that's another example of the class-based guilt idea. You know, it doesn't seem to me self-evident that I'm to blame for slavery, for example. I mean, being a Canadian, it's a slightly different situation, I suppose. But the idea that as a member of a culture, that you're somehow responsible for the past sins of that culture, let's say, it's a very, very anti-Western ethos. It goes along with this idea of class guilt, because your group membership is the most important thing. If your group at some point in the past did something reprehensible, which of course every group has done, that's for sure, then you're de facto responsible in the present for that.
How do you think we got to this point where people are repeating these patterns that were ultimately incredibly unsuccessful and dangerous and deadly in the past, like Marxism, for example? Like, people proudly proclaim themselves as having Marxist ideology.
One in five social scientists claims to be a Marxist.
How do they not understand the history? Well, why don't you fill people in on how that went bad?
Well, the estimates vary, but in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959, somewhere between 30 and 50 million people were killed in internal oppression alone. So that's pretty bad. And then in China, which was operating under exactly the same principles, it might have been up to 100 million killed during Mao's time. And of course, Mao is still revered in China, appallingly enough. And Vietnam and Cambodia, wherever these ideas were implemented, Cuba, wherever these ideas were implemented, the result was absolute mayhem. And I think what happened is that the Marxist ideas are actually quite attractive if you're an intellectual, and if you're, I would say, if you're tilted towards compassion from a personality perspective, because they're based on doctrines like from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And the idea that you should fulfill people's needs, or that society should fulfill people's needs, is on the surface of it an attractive idea. Of course, the problem is who gets to define the needs and who gets to define the abilities, and that really is a big problem. And then those ideas were put into practice. First in the Soviet Union, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, did a very lovely job of detailing in horrifying detail how those initial doctrines were transformed into legislation, and then how those legislation was transformed into endless genocide, essentially, and almost destroyed the world. Let's not forget that. Partly with the help of Castro, who just died. The doctrines, when put into practice, into actual practice, were murderous instantaneously. Now, what happened? There were always apologists for the left in the West, especially in France, especially among the French intellectuals, especially in the late 1960s. And then, when all of the information about what was happening in the Soviet Union came flooding forward, and that culminated, say, about 1973, when Solzhenitsyn's book was published, the French intellectuals changed their tune. Instead of agitating on the part of the working class, which allied them with murderous Marxists, they switched and started to talk about power and to talk about group identity. It was like a sleight of hand. The underlying pathological philosophy remained exactly the same, but the surface nomenclature changed. And that became very attractive. And at the same time, the Soviet Union dissolved. And so one of the problems I think we have now, a perverse problem, is that these Marxist ideas are very attractive to compassionate intellectuals. And we don't have good, bad examples like the Soviet Union around that everybody can point to and go, yeah, well, that sounds good, but, what about the murderous death camps and the millions of people who are suffering? We still have North Korea, but, people treat North Korea like it's a joke instead of like it's an exemplar of a pathological system. And people have no historical memory, like my students. And that's partly because they're taught so badly in schools, is they have no idea what happened in the Soviet Union. They have absolutely no idea. They know a little bit about the Second World War, maybe. And of course, people generally know about the Holocaust, but they have no idea what happened in the Soviet Union. So they have no idea where these ideas could lead. And the universities and the high schools are so full of people who are radically left-leaning that the students are never taught any proper history. They're taught about the evils of capitalism. And it's not like any system is perfect, but there's a difference between imperfect and consciously murderous.
I think one of the things that you just said that's very important is that it's attractive to compassionate intellectuals, people that, without really looking at what the potential for these laws and regulations, what the negative potential for them is, the underlying inclination to lean towards that is that you care about people and that you want people to be okay.
You're kind of treating them like they're your children. And I don't mean that in an entirely sarcastic manner. It's reasonable in some sense to treat other people like people that you love, although it's not reasonable in very many other ways, which is why you don't invite every stranger on the street to come and live with you in your house. I mean, everybody puts up boundaries, and you have to do that. But and people tend more than we ever expected. I've done a lot of research in this lab. People do tend to vote and think their temperament a lot more than anyone really realizes. And if you're kind and that's your highest virtue, then you tend to treat people like their kin. because that's what kind means, right? It's an extension of the word kin. But that doesn't work well in larger groups. You need other principles. And so you look at something like the idea of equity, which is equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity. On the surface of it, it seems perfectly reasonable to say, well, if every resource is distributed absolutely equally to every group, then the system is unfair. And on the face of it, that's a reasonable proposition, but it falls apart under minimal examination. So here's something to think about for everyone who thinks that equality of an outcome is a good idea. It's like, why the hell are you striving for anything then? Because the reason anyone strives to better themselves or to develop a skill or to move forward in life at all is to produce inequality. You're trying to rise above the mediocre masses every time you make an effort at anything. And so everything that we associate positive movement forward to or positive motivation is actually an attempt to render the world more unequal. Now, you're rendering it unequal in a just way, right? Because we might say, well, if you work really hard, you deserve an unequal outcome. Well, yeah, unless you want people to stop working hard. And that was the old joke in the Soviet Union. They pretend to pay us. We pretend to work. So it's so thoughtless. That's the problem.
That is a big problem with the phrase income inequality. You never hear effort anymore because effort is not the same.
Well, you know, on some campuses, and this is true in California, it's now considered a form of aggression. It's classified under microaggression to say that hard work is one of the reasons that people accumulate more value, accumulate more property, accumulate more money. It's an aggression. It's aggressive to say that because it implies that people who are poor don't work hard. Now, see, that's another terribly fuzzy form of thinking because there are lots of reasons for people to not have money. Many to be poor, let's say, which is even different than not having money. Alcoholism, drug addiction, mental illness, physical illness, intellectual incapacity, and lack of work. All of those things can
also environmental factors, communities you grow up into, what it's being exposed to. You limitate their atmosphere. You're around people that are constantly in trouble with the law, and you're dealing with horrible environments. There's a lot of factors.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that's really important about having these discussions is that they break down these rigid ideologies that a lot of these kids that are going to these universities are sort of being shoved into. They're being shoved into these ideologies. You're either on the left or you're on the right, and there's very few on the right. There's no open market of ideas when it comes to discussing these things. You're compelled and forced into certain categories.
Jonathan Haidt is the psychologist at the New York University Business School. He's done a really good job of documenting the dearth of ideological viewpoints, let's say political and temperament in the modern university. And it's appalling because along with all this push for ethnic and sexual and racial diversity, which I think is just a mask to enforce a kind of ideological homogeneity, there's no even understanding that ideational diversity is the only relevant value for a university. The rest of it's all predicated, say, on the assumption that if you do select people because of their ethnicity or racial background or gender, that will in and of itself produce diversity of ideas, which is another really pernicious idea because it assumes that, and it's so contradictory. The left describes anything that's associated with the assumption that someone who's female, for example, will think in a female way. They regard that as an unreasonable prejudice. Yet they're perfectly reasonable to say that we need more women in X discipline because they will bring in female ideas. It's like, well, what the hell are female ideas? You can't have it both ways unless you're unless you don't care at all about coherence or consistency, and ideologues really don't because they care about putting their ideology forward. But the idea that you're going to get a diversity of ideas because you have a diversity of class of people assumes that ideas and identity are the same thing, and that's an absurd proposition. In fact, that's an essentially racist proposition. Black people think differently some don't, and the overlap is substantial, and the difference between the individuals is far greater than